His most famous victory involved no army at all. Just an empty city, a few old men, and the complete psychological collapse of an enemy force 20 times his size. In 3rd century China, during the brutal Three Kingdoms period when the country had fractured into competing states and military genius was the difference between a kingdom surviving and being erased, Zhuge Liang served as the chief strategist of the state of Shu. He was not a warrior. He dressed as a scholar. He carried a fan, not a sword, and he became the most feared military mind of his era not because of the armies he commanded, but because of what he understood about how human minds work under pressure. His enemies learned to dread him. Not his weapons, him, the fact that he was thinking. In ancient China, warfare was understood primarily as a contest of material advantage. More soldiers, better weapons, superior terrain. The general with the largest force and the best position won. Strategy meant acquiring those advantages and deploying them effectively. The mental dimension of conflict was acknowledged but considered secondary. You overwhelmed the enemy with what you had. Zhuge Liang looked at this framework and found it incomplete. He watched larger forces lose to smaller ones repeatedly, not because of some physical reversal, but because their commanders had been manipulated into decisions that stripped away the advantage they held. The real contest, he concluded, was not happening on the battlefield. It was happening inside the minds of the people making decisions on both sides. We don't fight military battles, most of us. But every negotiation, every difficult conversation, every situation where two people have competing interests and the outcome depends on how each person reads the other, all of that runs on the same underlying logic. Whoever controls the psychological frame controls the result. Sound familiar? So what did Zhuge Liang actually understand that made him so consistently effective against opponents who had every material advantage? The empty fort story is the clearest example of his thinking, and it's worth sitting with carefully. He was at a garrison called Ziqing, with only a small number of support troops when a massive enemy force under the general Sima Yi arrived unexpectedly. No reinforcements were coming. No escape was possible. By every conventional military calculation, he was finished. What he did next made no sense. He opened the city gates. Wide open. He sent his soldiers away, or had them hidden. He climbed to the top of the gate tower himself, sat down with his fan and an instrument, and began playing music. Calm, unhurried music. A few elderly attendants swept the streets below him. Sima Yi arrived at the head of a massive army and found this. He stopped, studied the scene, and then, after a long silence, ordered his entire force to retreat. His commanders were baffled. They had the enemy completely surrounded and outgunned. Why retreat from an open gate? Sima Yi explained. Zhuge Liang does not take risks. If he has opened the gates and is sitting calmly in plain sight, the city is full of soldiers waiting in ambush. To enter is to walk into a trap. There was no trap. The city was essentially empty. Sima Yi had been defeated by his own accurate understanding of Zhuge Liang's reputation, turned into a weapon against him. Notice the specific genius here. Zhuge Liang did not try to deceive Sima Yi about his character. He used the truth of his character, his reputation for careful, unfailingly methodical strategy, as the instrument of deception. Sima Yi's analysis was completely correct. Zhuge Liang would never expose himself like that unless something invisible was happening. The mistake was not in the reasoning. The mistake was in not realizing that the reasoning itself was what was being manipulated. This is the level Zhuge Liang was operating at. Not one move ahead. 2 moves into his opponent's psychology. He wrote and taught extensively about the principle underneath this piece, said that every person carries a map of how the world works, built from their experience and their beliefs about how things operate. Decisions are made by consulting that map. The commander who understands an enemy's map can alter the terrain without moving a single soldier. Because what the enemy sees on their map is not what is actually there. The implications are not limited to warfare. Think about negotiation. Most people approach a negotiation thinking about their own position and the other person's position, both understood as fixed. Zhuge Liang would approach it by first understanding the map the other person is navigating. What do they believe about how situations like this normally resolve? What do they expect you to do? What does their past experience lead them to predict? And then, rather than fighting their position directly, he would arrange the situation so that their own map led them to the conclusion he wanted. This is not manipulation in a dishonest sense. It's a more complete understanding of how persuasion actually works. Arguments address the surface. Psychological framing addresses the underlying map. Change the map, and the argument resolves itself. The specific technique he returned to most consistently was what might be called reputation management as strategy. He was meticulous about being known as careful, methodical, never reckless. He built that reputation deliberately because it made certain moves available to him that would be unavailable to someone else. A general known for boldness could not have played the empty city gambit. The trick only works if the enemy knows you would never risk an open gate unless it was a trap. Watch how this applies to you in ordinary situations. Your reputation, the map other people carry of how you behave, is a strategic asset you probably don't think about deliberately. When people know you never make commitments you don't keep. That reputation creates leverage in every interaction where a commitment is involved. When people know you always research carefully before speaking. That reputation means your statements carry weight that other people's don't. When people know you stay calm under pressure, they cannot rattle you by creating pressure, because they know from experience it won't work. Zhuge Liang built his reputation the way a craftsman builds a tool, deliberately, over time, with specific uses in mind. The second thing he understood was the danger of fighting on the terms the other side has set. Sima Yi set the terms at Zicheng: overwhelming force versus small garrison, material advantage versus material disadvantage. Zhuge Liang refused those terms entirely. He changed the question from who has more soldiers to what is Zhuge Liang actually planning. On that question, Sima Yi had already lost before either side moved. The practical version of this is asking, before any significant conflict or negotiation, whose frame am I operating inside? If the terms of engagement were set by the other side, what would it look like to change those terms entirely? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the material reality is just the material reality. But more often than people realize, the frame is not fixed. It was set by whoever was thinking more carefully at the moment when the terms got established. He spent his career being the person who set the terms, not through force, through understanding, consistently and in advance, how his opponents' minds worked, what maps they were navigating, and what arrangements of reality would lead those maps to the conclusions he needed. The battlefield was almost secondary. The real contest was always between two ways of understanding what was happening. He won that contest so consistently that his name became synonymous with strategic wisdom in Chinese culture for the next 1800 years. He left the fan, not the sword, as his symbol. That choice was intentional. Subscribe if this one made you think differently. The next video goes into another strategist who mastered a completely different dimension of the same principle.